Hi, everyone. My name is Eray Çaylı, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all on behalf of Decolonial Cities Collective. And we'd like to warmly welcome you to the Decolonial Cities Collective Dialogue number 3, The Language of Extractivism, Anti-Extractivism, and Post-Extractivism. Before we proceed with the dialogue itself, I wanted to start by holding some space for reflection. This is an event that involves individuals and institutions from various parts of the world, each with its own histories of coloniality, dispossession, and racial disregard for life, as well as, of course, struggles for justice and reparation mounted against these violent processes. So I simply wanted to start by allowing everyone in this call to take a moment to quietly reflect on the places that we are tuning into this call from, and the kind of violent processes, as well as long-standing pursuits of self-determination that have taken place in each of these places, and in many cases continue to take place. Thank you. So I'm one of the co-hosts of today's dialogue, together with Dr. Grace Adeniyi Ogunyakin, and we're both members of the Colonial Cities Collective. And we have two scholars joining us today in this dialogue as our guests, Dr. Comfort Azubuka Uda and Dr. Zeki Kanay. They will each take 20 minutes to speak, one after the other. During their contributions, you, as the audience, will have the opportunity to ask questions via the chat box, as well as upvoting each of these questions. After the two contributions, we will move on to the Q&A, where you, again, as participants, will be able to ask further questions. And the event is being recorded, as has already been mentioned, and it will be available on the Decolonial Cities Collective website. Alongside myself and Grace, Melanie, Dennis Unrao, and Tanzil Shafiq, I should say, also doctors, also from the collective, have taken up Q&A moderation and Zoom tech roles today. So many thanks to them. And on my own personal behalf, special double thanks to Melanie in joining me and Grace in the planning process of this event by really generously shouldering much of the logistical work. Last but not least, a big thank you to our interpreters, Özge Gündüz and Ahuse Bedino, who will be translating Zeki's contribution into English for us all and also translating our questions and comments for Zeki as well. And we're obviously very grateful to both our guest contributors today for joining us. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Grace, who will introduce Dr. Comfort Azubuka Uda, our first speaker in today's dialogue.
Thank you, Irai, and hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Comfort Azubuka Uda, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English and the African Studies program at the University of Toronto. She works primarily in African literature, eco-criticism, urbanity, and post-colonial theories. With a focus on environmental justice and the politics of storytelling, particularly in conversation with global politics in African locales, her teaching and scholarship is invested in the nature and politics of storytelling as it relates to landscapes and more than human agency in literature. She holds an MA and PhD in English from UCLA and was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Leslie Center for the Humanities at Dartmouth College. Comfort, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I should have been ready to unmute already. Thank you. So I'm going to speak a little bit today about a chapter of my book project that focuses on Warri, which is a city in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. I'm not going to talk too much about the sort of in-depth arguments of that chapter. Instead, I'm going to focus on the portions having to do with language and the subject of our conversation today. So the Niger Delta region tends to be narrativized in the context of environmental degradation, oil exploitation, and eco-activism, especially given the enduring global legacy of figures like Ken Saro-Wiwa, who became a martyr for the cause. This is the context that creates the broader issues that I address in my work. When we focus so heavily on stories of oil extraction, what gets lost? This is the question. So in her 2020 documentary film called Wearing the Mask, The Politics of Authenticity and Contemporaneity in the Worlds of African Art, Zina Saro-Wiwa remarks in exasperation. And she says, I don't want our works reduced to being emblems of political strife, and I'm tired and depressed at the way militants hijack the Niger Delta's multifaceted and unique identity. She says these are reductive gestures focusing on the oil, and there are other far less harrowing and expansive stories to tell about the region. In keeping with the objective to engage some of these less harrowing and more expansive stories, my goal is to focus on one major urban space in the Niger Delta region, so that's Warri, and by paying attention to a different mode of narrativization, begin the work of presenting a much better rounded image of the regional identities and spatial character born out of the Niger Delta as a cultural region of the nation, not just as a geopolitical or ecological zone. I attempt to answer the question, where can we acknowledge and recuperate the idiosyncratic urban culture identities peculiar to the Delta region, narrating the cultures of the Delta region beyond the stories of crises surrounding oil extraction, militancy, environmental degradation, and activism is certainly, I think, a good place to start. Therefore, in this chapter, I argue that we must recognize the pipeline of comedic and cultural currency from cities in the Delta region, Warri in particular, to Niger, which I use as a term to capture the informal cultural space of the Nigerian population that's kind of distinct from the official nation state, Nigeria itself. Paying attention in this way, hopefully will avoid recreating a parallel of the disempowering relationship between the Niger Delta region and Nigeria at large in the context of the global oil market. It's true that oil is a far more charismatic subject. The dangers it poses are, in spite of the fact that it still results in what Reb Nixon calls slow violence, they're more immediate than what's at stake in the stand-up comedy industry. However, Nixon also charges that it's important to engage the representational, narrative, and strategic challenges posed by the relative invisibility of slow violence. So I explore the enduring trends in Nigeria's stand-up comedy industry, and what they can tell us about the Delta region, and the agency of its people within an international context. So I do not go so far as to politicize the humor of Nigerian stand-up comedy, because the worry persona that I analyze in this work is not often funny in a way that's explicitly conscious of political subversion. So towing Zina Sarawiwa's line, there was no effort to make these acts of agency through performance into examples of activism. Instead, I break down 5 main observable features of the worry persona in order to offer a better understanding of what it signifies for the Delta cultural region and the particular urban spaces located therein. So these kind of 5 features that I focus on are: first, a provincial pride that's based on the region at large, or worry as a lived space in particular. Second is a robust confidence in one's resourcefulness, or what we could call the character's street smart and streetwise disposition. Third was an unwillingness to be overlooked and a determination to insist on oneself. Fourth is a propensity to take up space through the physicality of the character on stage, screen, street, or even creek, if we think about the militants. And finally, and this is the part that I will focus the most on today, is a confident mastery of Nigerian Pidgin English, or NPE, in its most developed state. So first, focusing on cultural production through comedy answers some of the questions raised by Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his Marxist critique of the high literary culture of African literature in the 20th century. So he has this piece called The Language of African Literature, where he critiques critiques the use of European languages in what we're calling African literature. And he has a Marxist analysis or critique of this moment. And he says, instead, that the peasantry, in contrast to what he saw as the elitist circle of writers and literary culture producers, he says that the peasantry had no complexes about their languages and the cultures that they carried. In fact, when the peasantry and the working class were compelled by necessity or history to adopt the language of the master, they Africanized it without any respect for its ancestry, as shown by people like Senghor and Achebe. So totally as to have created new African languages like Creole in Sierra Leone or Pidgin in Nigeria that owed their identities to the syntax and rhythms of African languages. Ngugi wa Thiong'o was invested in language use and African cultural productions, focusing on literature, cinema. These are forms of what we might imagine as high culture. He read the use of European languages as a marker of class-based distinctions and elitism. This is important as we think through what we can learn when we turn towards stand-up comedy as a form and Pidgin English as a language, encoding urban, regional, and national cultures. So Nigerian Pidgin English sort of serves in some ways as a site of epistemic agency and also as a resource to be co-opted. In addition to the richness and creative fecundity that's permitted by the language, its accessibility makes it a lucrative narrative medium for mixed audiences. However, Nigerian Pidgin English originated in the Niger Delta region, and it is there that it exists in its most complex and developed form. Berogi writes that Pidgin languages are characterized by a simple, often anarchic and rudimentary grammatical structure, a severely limited vocabulary, and are used for the expression of really basic thought processes. This is because they emerge as emergency languages for casual, short-term linguistic encounters, end quote. However, when Pidgin acquires complex or well-ordered rule-governed grammatical forms, a rich lexicon for the expression of complex thoughts, and becomes the first language of a people, they mutate into creoles. This description applies to varieties of Niger Delta Pidgin English. The versions of the language spoken in that region are quite rich. They have their own idioms and proverbs and rules guiding the formulation of the language, and they also go far beyond expressing basic thought processes in short-term linguistic encounters. Berogi concedes that NPE is now increasingly being creolized, especially in Nigeria's deep south, by which he means the south-south region of the country, and in such cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic urban centers as Lagos and Abuja, although it's still referred to as a pidgin. There isn't really one clear moment at which an emergent language shifts from one category to the other, According to Akinremi, NPE did develop as a trade or makeshift language which arose to fulfill the communicative needs created by the contact between the peoples of the multilingual coastal regions of Nigeria and the Europeans who came as traders. Here, Akinremi points out how the multi-ethnic and multilingual nature of the Delta region acts as a fertile ground for nurturing emergent cultures and languages which evolve over time. The fact that the Delta coasts were multilingual makes the trajectory of language evolution distinct from a coastal region like Lagos, which was primarily dominated by one language, Yoruba. As pidgin language grew and developed, it spread throughout the nation to become a language of improvisation or emergency in urban centers around the country where multiple ethnic groups converge and must communicate with each other regardless of class, ethnicity, or literacy level. Nigeria's pidgin English is typically utilized as an informal medium of communication in the oral domain. However, its domains of use in the course of the past 2 decades expanded into public broadcasting. The accessibility of NPE makes it very valuable in an urban setting, and there are nationwide and regional radio stations that broadcast exclusively in the language. Recently, the BBC, in the past few years, I believe, initiated BBC Pidgin alongside BBC online news outlets in Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba, the 3 major native languages in Nigeria, in recognition of the widespread use and value of this informal language. However, this also raises concerns about the possibility of this foreign broadcasting company becoming the chaperones of written pidgin as it continues to evolve into a Creole. As a language of emergency and a rising Creole, there are no formal rules for spelling or writing it. The new imperialist implications of a British company undertaking this task in service of a former British colony are particularly troubling. Although there are local radio stations that use NPE exclusively, these are still spoken words that differ in flavor from one city or one region to the next. So for instance, in the case of Ori, there's a dialect of pidgin that's called Wafi, right? And I don't have the time to talk about that now, so I'm going to move on. But the point is that they're not written and saved for posterity like the BBC Pidgin Online. Therefore, there is less risk of the language formalizing and calcifying along whatever parameters for transcription are set by these media. Along with its spread and the recognition of the accessibility NP offers, it, quote, has continued to increase in number of speakers and economic value and to expand to more diverse segments of society and domains of use, end quote, moving largely away from its previous association with the poor and illiterate populations. This language has thus over time become an urban lingua franca of the nation. Through the natural progress of spreading NPE, NPE has developed distinct flavors as words from various languages were incorporated into it, depending on the ethnic groups that dominate each region. In this vein, the spread of NPE to the cosmopolitan city of Lagos is said to be a recent development, and more recently, the spread of NPE has been facilitated by the media, music, and comedy. The association of Nigerian Pidgin English with popular culture and the fashionable media of music and comedy cultivates the economic value of the language and thus opens it up for exploitation. It was once the case that within the Nigerian imaginary, Pidgin retained its association with illiteracy, poverty, and sexual license, while English, on the other hand, operates as a linguistic signifier of affluence in the popular arts. However, NPE is now utilized by virtually every category of speaker, from illiterates to university professors. This is a quote from Akinremi. This previous perception of the language falls away over time, and is no longer true that the Nigerian elite is not seen speaking Pidgin. This assumption collapses, particularly in the context of the Niger Delta, where both poems considered high literature and popular hip-hop music are written in the same language. It also does not apply in the context of comedy shows, largely dominated by comedians with a strong Niger Delta identity, where audiences range from highly rated actors and ruling politicians in federal positions to average citizens. As a result of the increasing ubiquity of the language, it is increasingly being exploited for its high economic value, even though in the national context, Nigerian Pidgin enjoys no form of official recognition. So massively popular and well-attended series of comedy shows like Opa Williams's Night of a Thousand Laughs or Ayamakun's AY Live and Bovi's Bovie Man on Fire. These are just a series of stand-up comedy shows, amongst others. They depend very heavily on pidgin English, both for the humor of the sets and for the accessibility of the shows as a whole. Accessibility and marketability of the shows. It is therefore not unusual for a show with 10 acts to feature 8 or more comedians who deliver their sets entirely in pidgin, except for moments where they might switch or code switch to English to offer formal greetings to the audience before they dive into their set. The use of NPE emerges as a key strategy to make sure the comedy shows sell to the widest audience. However, this monetization of the language also leans heavily on its origins in the Niger Delta, its existence as a creolizing language in that region, and the robust cultural capital all these qualities entail. It is another way in which the characters of the Niger Delta, its landscapes, and its peoples are co-opted. Nigerian Pidgin English is often used as a signifier of inter-ethnic balance or as an ethnically neutral code, according to Akinremi. It is supposedly the language of the people, forged over time as many languages represented in Nigerian cities contribute to the NPE lexicon, making it an ethnically balanced language that is able to accommodate the contributions of substrate languages. Now, I don't mind the term ethnically balanced because I do think that rings true. But although the accessibility and ubiquity of NPE cannot be denied, I would not go so far as calling it a neutral code or neutral language where ethnicity is concerned, especially if we were to think of it in its most creolized form, which exists only in the Niger Delta region or amongst its peoples. This is because the various socio-political and cultural regions of Nigeria are still tied to ethnic identities, even if those ethnic identities are grouped, as is the case for the Middle Belt and Niger Delta regions. This diffusion of ethnic identities calls into question the subject of ownership. The recognition of authorship and ownership is not as widely prevalent as it ought to be. Okay. Sorry, I lost my place. The diffusion of ethnic identity calls into question the subject of ownership. The recognition of authorship and ownership is not as widely prevalent as it ought to be. As Nigerian Pidgin English becomes increasingly monetized and exploited for its vast economic value, it is necessary to pay attention to the particularities of those spaces from which these cultural pieces emerge, and to intervene against history repeating itself by denying agency, credit, value, and recognition to the most dedicated stewards of the language. The language of ethnic neutrality, as a way to describe what this language encodes, certainly threatens to do just that by denying the vast impact the Delta region has had on the trends in Niger popular culture and on this language in particular. This impact is most clearly measurable in cases such as the stand-up comedy industry and how the Wari persona in particular dominates that scene. And now I'm kind of wrapping up by dealing with some of the uneasiness with doing this work that I'm doing. So in making my argument, I'm keenly aware of a tension that emerges between my goal of turning away from the crises of extractivism, where oil is concerned, and the revelation of a different kind of extractivist structure to do with culture this time, in my analysis of stand-up comedy. In my work, I approach the comedy acts from an angle which sees them as forms of entertainment that through their performance and subsequent co-opting by other groups becomes first a way for people with Niger Delta urban identities to claim agency, whether it's narrative, economic, or creative agency. And second, as another way that the Nigerian public at large acts again as a nation to co-opt a resource of the Delta without sort of giving due credit or taking part in the stewardship and responsibility that needs to be enacted. So there's an uneasiness in reading agency in the cultural production that these Wari comedians engage in, while also recognizing the possible loss of agency via the extractivist disposition of the stand-up comedy industry. However, I believe that it can be productive. It can be a productive uneasiness, and that there's value in dwelling on it. That's it.
Very much. Thank you very much, Comfort. That was an excellent contribution. I'm sure many of us already have many questions. I at least do. I'm looking forward to sharing them later. But now, if that's okay with everyone, we're going to move ahead with Zeki's contribution. And I'd like to introduce Zeki. So Assistant Professor Dr. Zeki Kana is a veterinarian based in Ahmed, or Diyarbakir, Turkey's largest predominantly Kurdish inhabited city. He's an independent academic, a signatory of the 2016 Academics for Peace petition, alongside more than 2,000 scholars who signed this petition to protest the war that had then erupted in Kurdish cities, in towns and cities in northern Kurdistan. So in 2017, he was summarily dismissed from his position at Dicle University, that is a local university in Ahmed. Its faculty of veterinary sciences, veterinary medicine, for signing this petition. Following his dismissal, Kanai has dedicated most of his time to farming, and especially growing vegetables and wheat using local seeds and without the use of chemicals. Kanai defines agricultural work as a communal experience based on mutual aid. He has also served as the president of the Diyarbakir Chamber of Veterinarians and a council member for Bağlar municipality, which is a district of Ahmed. He remains a member of Turkey's Education and Science Workers Union. He describes himself as someone who strives to lead a life that respects nature and the land. So just a note of caution for anyone who would like to listen to Zeki's contribution in English, because he won't actually be speaking in English. What you have to do is there is a kind of globe, a sphere sign at the bottom of your screen where you see interpretation. I think that's what it says there. You click on it and you choose English, as well as choosing mute original audio, so that you can hear our interpreters who will be translating Zeki's contribution for us into English. Okay, the floor is yours, Mamoste.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank everyone for giving me the floor, and I would like to begin by telling you a quick story. And this story revolves around wheat, which is the main feeder for everyone. And I would like to begin this story by quoting the Cuban poet José Martí, who also took part back in the day in his country's independence movement and who has always guided me. He said, "A man has no other duty than to do good things in the land where he lives." And I believe that the task that awaits us today is such a task. And this is what I try to do. This is what I'm aiming at. And let me also quickly talk about our geography. Everybody is familiar with Mesopotamia, but I believe that we need to redefine Mesopotamia. It is the stretch of land between these two big rivers, but because of all the dams that have been built there, these rivers do not flow any more, and this is why we need to redefine this geography. And in the last 12,000 years, of a total of 2 million years of human history, the lands we live on have had a significant say. They were very much at the center of the history of humankind, this exact geography of Mesopotamia. And with the end of the mini ice age, so to speak, climatic conditions, etc., became so favorable that people began engaging in husbandry and agricultural activities. They first have gotten to know all the plants that were edible, and they have gotten to know different kinds of cattle and pigs, animals that could be domesticated. And they've gotten to know, as I've said, wheat, barley, rye, lentils, chickpeas, and what have you. And they knew how, they learned how to cultivate them. And this led them also to domesticate pigs and sheep and goats. These animals were first domesticated in this very geography, and it was wheat basically that domesticated the humans. They settled, they built houses, and they further engaged in agricultural activities. And this is called Neolithic Revolution, and this is a coinage by Gordon Childe. And the Max Planck Institute engaged in a series of genetic analyses that they've conducted revolving around wheat, and they have proved that wheat spread to the world from Kerejdağ. And this is a rich source of energy, and this rich source of energy enabled people to build the huge places of worship for which this geography is known for. This is all thanks to wheat and the cultivation of wheat. Back in the day, roughly 12,000 years ago, people were hunters and gatherers. They were moving non-stop, but once they discovered wheat and how to cultivate it, they were able to settle, and different kinds of religions emerged from that, and states were formed, and so on and so forth. And you may be familiar with Göbekli Tepe, Jire Miraza, a very important place of worship that came about 12,000 years ago. And in order to build such a humongous structure, of course, you need a vast source of energy. And let me also mention that wheat is considered holy and sacred in Kurdistan. You never pay for wheat. You either exchange it in exchange for another good, or in exchange for a particular kind of service. But today, everybody knows the price of wheat, but unfortunately, we do not know of its value. So we can say in Mesopotamia, at least that is what we say, grains created states. It could be stored and harvested simultaneously. It could be stored for a long time. And during harvest time, tax collectors would come and take their share in taxes. And this also led to the fact that when it comes to the emergence of language, grain agriculture played a huge role. And we can easily say that Kurdish is the mother tongue of wheat and agriculture. Language developed here as expected, but not many people know this. If we take, for example, the word agriculture, agar, the first part, hega, and kolo, kolandin in Kurdish. So both phonetically speaking and both semantically, today's Kurdish actually coined this term. So lots of agricultural terminology stems from the Kurdish language, but unfortunately, as Kurdish is not a language of instruction, it's been exploited, and this is why this etymology is not well known to a wider audience. And wheat and other grains were transformed into bread under the skillful hands on the fertile soil of Mesopotamia. And this is why Mesopotamia turned into a center of attraction for many peoples, but this center of attraction was exploited. Again, to quote Jose Marti, societies that do not obtain their food are slaves, because one who is dependent on others cannot be free. And this is precisely why the people of this region were liberated, yes, by production in the past, but unfortunately today they paid and are still paying a very heavy price for their freedom. And for the city I am living in, Diyarbakir, three civilizations crossed here, and this fact is being exploited by current administration because the very fact that these civilizations met in Diyarbakir also means that this area, this geography was exploited for the longest time. So geography is your faith, is what we say. Why? Back in the day, our supraterraneous resources were abundant, and we do know for a fact that the natural resources underground are abundant as well. And together with the sun, water, and the soil, you produce, and this production is holy. But we have not learned, unfortunately, to live together peacefully. And the wheat belongs to us, the soil belongs to us, but why are we still hungry is a question that many people ask. This has to do with the natural resources that are abundant in this geography, and I cannot go into the details, unfortunately, but let me just say around 1877-78, during the Ottoman-Russian War, or right after it, a bread revolt broke out in Ahmed and the region in 1880 as a result of drought and a severe winter. And only 100 or 150 people said something back in the day. They engaged in uprising, but this is a small number of people, so nobody listened. And some Kurdish tribes, together with Armenian tribes, engaged in ethnic clashes, and this turned into massacres. And then after 30 years, it resulted in a mass genocide. This geography, mind you, was multi-ethnic, multicultural, and also polyglottal, and Armenians were genocided, and they have been expelled from their motherland. Another tragic incident in 1955, right after the Second World War, another tragic event happened. Since the exploiters and the administration did not engage in equal distribution of the sources, the peasants and the villagers were sold wheat, but this was poisoned wheat. This is what many authors wrote about. This is a black wound, also the name of a book.
Well, many things happened. I won't go into details. We aim to do something because the land that we exist on is valuable, it's precious. But what we do is on a very small scale because industrial agriculture and the capitalist system is so dominant. But we will persevere. In Diyarbakır, we have an ecology association, and we have some modest work that we carry out here. We have an agriculture, seeds, and food commission, and then a forestation commission. So we carry out some activities with the use of these commissions. We have a small agricultural land and some land that we rent. I'll tell you a different story. How we started planting tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. In 2017, no, in 2014, ISIS attacked Shanghai. The Yazidi people there was a huge atrocity, and those who were able to run came to northern Kurdistan, and they were placed in a camp there. But because of differences in faith, they were isolated so that there were no problems. So in this isolated place, there was no social activity, no interactions with anyone. Sometimes women didn't leave their tents for 6 months. This is something that we were told by psychologists there. They say people are killing themselves, they're committing suicide. So the question was how to enable these people to interact, to socialize, to go outside of the tent. These people were people who used to live in villages, peasants that planted vegetables in the past. So we decided that they would create orchards or little gardens next to each tent. But there were no seeds either. So some friends started traveling from one village to the other, collecting seeds, and those seeds were brought and delivered to the Shanghai people, the Yazidi people. They had the culture anyway. They knew how to plant, how to harvest, etc. So together, they engaged in this planting activity. They met their own needs, and then they offered the rest to the other tents because there were many, many tents there. Then, for whatever reason, the state removed them from this camp and put them in a place closer to the border. This was, done on purpose to cut down the social solidarity and to stop the communication amongst the peoples and, to isolate people from one another. That was the idea. Once they left, there was experience left behind as well as seeds. So we decided to do what with these? Well, in 2016, 2017, the municipalities were taken away from us. They assigned representatives, and we started to question what to do next, what to do with these seeds. We had a small land, 3 acres big, and we decided to plant the seeds there so that we can multiply them. Starting 2017, we planted vegetables there, and it grew. We gave saplings to people. We exchanged seeds. Of course, there's climate crisis affecting our region as well as the rest of the world. Sometimes it's extremely hot, and sometimes whatever we plant burns. They don't thrive. Some years we have fertility. Sometimes there's no harvest. In 2017, the mother of a friend who is 100 years old, she lives in a village. She had in a little sock the seeds from the weeds that she planted in the past. She gave them to us. We brought them in. Of course, we knew not much about this because we were born in villages, but we grew up in cities. So I was lacking this culture. We planted this wheat. The next year it was 500 grams. The next year it was 2 or 5 kilograms. Then over time we saw there were different sorts of plants. And we were asking everyone, what are these? And nobody knew what these different spikes were about. So this documentary person, he made a documentary about the spikes that we had, a handful of weeds. So we found out there were 5 or 6 different sorts of crops here, and we went to that mother that gave us the seeds because she was the only one who could know. She would be the only person. So we found her village. It was so exciting, and we planted those spikes in front of her, and we asked her, so you sent us these plants, mother, tell us, what is the story? What are their names? And she told us one by one. This one is called Ashare. She told us about the type of the wheat. This is Halespi. She was speaking a dialect of Kurdish, Zaza. Halespi means white wheat. She said, this one is Bakacak. This one is Sembersia. And this one is Korek. And this one, don't plant this one because this will grow mushrooms. So Sembersia, 1 year we planted 1 scale and the next year it gave us 20. This is this sort of fertility. And normally, we would use, people would use fertilizers and chemicals. We lost our old heritage. I have the weeds. I'm still trying to produce, but on a smaller scale. I'm trying to purify them. I'm trying to isolate them from one another. This year, I planted them. Yesterday, I went with my friend to harvest. I need to have new weeds coming from them so that I can replant, and we still have more work to do in the farm. After COVID and the earthquake, people fell apart. The economic crisis meant that people would not really be able to travel anymore. So our relationships are loose now. We need to develop our relations once again, and we need to work collectively and keep working the soil. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dr.
I don't know if I still have more time or whether I ran out of it.
If you need to take a few more minutes, you can.
Okay. I forgot to tell you about the Hefsel Gardens in Ahmet, Diyarbakır. They go back to 2,800 years ago in the Assyrian resources. An Assyrian king surrounds the Amedu city back then. Of course, the castle is very strong. It's made from basalt stones. He tries and tries, but he cannot siege. He cannot conquer the castle. He says, I destroyed their gardens. I made towers out of people's skulls. So he describes every atrocity there is. Assyrians left behind good records of history. We know what happened. So there's a castle in Ahmed, and it is #1 globally in terms of how tall it is and how robust. And right next to it, there were some tiny gardens inside the castle, actually. And in the neighboring area, there were the Hefsel Gardens right along the Tigris River. And this, until the 60s and 70s, these gardens were meeting the fruit and vegetable needs of the city. In 2015, these gardens became part of the UNESCO World Heritage List, but unfortunately, right now, they're in a desperate situation. And this year, UNESCO put it in the list of under threat heritage, but Turkey is a party state. Last month, they held a meeting, and somehow they removed it from the list of, heritage under threat. They were given time. So they told them to at least fix these gardens that they destroyed, but unfortunately right now nothing is being done. These gardens had an exemplary use of land and soil and water. Let me tell you about the use of water in this garden. First, there is a faucet that has a great flow, and in the past there were leather processing facilities there. So the water would go through these leather processes first. And then before the gardens, at a certain height, there are 5 mills. This water was running the mills. These were wheat mills. They were processing wheat to make flour. And then the water would go to the gardens for irrigation. And there was a culture in the gardens. For 6 months, the people of Diyarbakir would have fun there. They would entertain themselves. They had little huts next to the water, and they would produce and they would have fun. Here, there is a concept called ashetçis. Most of the workers there were women. So when landowners went there, they would have these women coming there. They would work in the land, on the land, and then those women, the female workers, agricultural workers, would receive their pay in harvest, in product. So whatever the produce was from the land, they would receive it as payment. And then they would go to the market and sell their products. There was a great number of fruits produced here: plums, peaches, apricots, mulberries. The people were close to the gardens, the people in Sur, and they were placed away from this land because of the war, because of the conflicts, and because of urban regeneration, as they call it. So they forced them away from these lands, so they have no ownership of the gardens anymore. And now there's industrial agriculture. They are trying to cut down the trees, and they're turning their area into corn plantations. We are very much against this. We fought very hard on it, but until now, no progress. Hopefully, from now on, this trajectory will be abandoned, and the land will remain as the heritage of humanity, and it will serve its purpose like it did before, and it will be an example to other peoples. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kenai, for that wonderful presentation. I learned a lot about seeds and land and all that stuff. Now is a time that I would like to open up the floor to both you and Comfort to see if you have anything that you would like to say in response to each other. So if you do, then you can go ahead. Otherwise, Irai and I will go in and give our response to you, and then we will open up the floor to the rest of the audience.
I don't have any comments right now.
Okay, thank you, Comfort.
Thank you very much. What you explained about language is really interesting, but I'm quite intrigued by the formation of these new languages about environmental justice, the extraction of petroleum. Indeed, around the globe, ecological destruction is really terrifying. I wish you success in the struggle. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. So I have a response or a question for you, Comfort. First of all, I really enjoyed your presentation, so thank you for that. And it gave me a lot of food for thought, especially I remember my friends and I were initially very excited when BBC had the pidgin version. We're like, oh, BBC has pidgin now, but now that you're saying it and putting it like that in terms of what it means to now put pidgin into written form and how that's a form of neo-imperialism, that was really food for thought in terms of what it means to on the one hand challenge the dominance of a language, so English and reading the news, but then now it's like the BBC has taken that over. But that's not really my question. I just wanted to say that gave me food for thought. So I really liked what you seem to be grappling with, because, you know, academia is never really easy in terms of how you mentioned the uneasiness of wanting to turn away from the crisis of extraction in terms of how we think about the Niger Delta region. And then on the one hand, where you're talking about other forms of narrativization and, you know, culture that's not so much high culture in the sense of comedy and pidgin. But in talking about that, and particularly in looking at Ori, you also mentioned that now, you know, that language of pidgin is being co-opted and it's being monetized. So you ended your presentation by talking about how there's an uneasiness, but you noted that there can be a productive uneasiness and that there's value in dwelling on it. And I felt like that was a cliffhanger. So I'm wondering, is there, could you possibly expand a bit on that in terms of what you mean? What does this productive uneasiness and look like? And what value is there on dwelling on it? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Why don't you just accept the cliffhanger and that will be your uneasiness? Anyway, but I think that is coming from a place of, I guess, epistemic humility in a way, because there's a tendency, well, there's a dangerous tendency, I think, to just have an absolute assuredness as a scholar and especially when you're laying claim to expertise in these kinds of circles, to like be able to say completely like, here's the answer to this. But I think that while it's important to sort of call out the extractivist structure that exists in this kind of cultural space, it's important to also be careful not to remove the agency of the people by sort of doing this thing of reading them once again as victims who've been taken from over and over. Because in the comedy industry and in some of the comedic acts I actually close read in this work, there's a lot of individual agency that plays itself out in economic agency, because then they're able to make money out of it, or creative license and all these things. And so it's difficult to make an absolute argument about extractivism in this context, because it threatens to undo the empowerment that is also enacted in these spaces. So speaking of cultural extractivism also involves sort of recognizing the or deferring to in some ways to the individual and communal agencies that make up that culture, because there's a lattice of agencies going on there. And so me just dealing with the uneasiness, I think in some ways it's being deferential in a way that doesn't say it's this or that, by allowing for the idea that both of these things can be true, and they can be true to varying degrees depending on the situational context or the individual and so on. And with Pidgin English as well, there are the distinct dialects, but the truth is that even though the most creolized forms exist in the Niger Delta, and the persona is sort of applied to a wider like Niger audience or Niger persona, there are still versions of Pidgin English that are more Pidgin than Creole that exist in other parts of the country. And so you can't even like make an absolute claim about that language, even though you can recognize the origins of it to honor that history and to sort of honor the, I guess, the onus of stewardship that's still borne by the Niger Delta people. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's the best I have right now.
I'll take that. Thank you so much, Comfort. Over to you, Irai.
Okay, thank you so much again for those wonderfully stimulating contributions. I'll try to somehow interweave both contributions and try to maybe pose a question that maybe primarily is something that would resonate with Zeki, but hopefully also then with Comfort. There are great parallels, actually, resonances. Also because I'm a person who's worked in Ahmed and also to a certain extent with Zeki himself. And based on what I know, this kind of the kind of risk that is involved in the formalization of a language is really something that you also see with Kurdish, because obviously it was banned for many years, decades even. But then more recently, the state seems to have embraced it, at least in terms of the spaces that Zeki mentioned today, Hefsal Gardens, the kind of historic center of Ahmed. You see Kurdish everywhere, but yet it still lacks the status that obviously people have been campaigning for decades. It's not taught in schools. There's no actual state support for it. It's therefore turned into something of like a folkloric kind of element, right? It's insofar as the state is concerned. Now, obviously, that there's the kind of dangers involved in the formalization of a language are very present. And I thought that was a very striking resonance between the two presentations. But my question, maybe to abstract it a level. So language, obviously symbolic, operating on a symbolic level. Like obviously it is very material, but going back to your point about culture, Comfort, you did say you want to expand on this kind of on these debates on extraction that we've had to date, which I suppose have focused on conventional industries of extraction, right? Like fossil fuels and corporate agriculture and things like that. And you want to expand on that. Which I guess is also the case with something like tourism, because Hefsal Gardens, actually one of the things that happened when it received UNESCO World Heritage Site status, obviously became a huge touristic site, and the state didn't actually miss that opportunity. It kind of intervened into the space, created these kind of paths that you as tourists are supposed to use to explore Hefsal Gardens, and cafes started popping up, etc., etc. If you consider something like a heritage as also a realm that involves, that operates on a symbolic level, not only on a material level, but also symbolic and cultural level, I think there's something there that potentially resonates with what Comfort also spoke about in terms of the extractivist industries, or in terms of industries that have not maybe to date really been kind of extractivist in a conventional sense, becoming extractivist industries, right? Language and humor is one example. Heritage is another example. So my question is really, so first to Zeki, maybe, how do you, because I know also Zeki, you are running a kind of, last time I was there, you had also a kind of patch of gardens near Hefsal, or almost in Hefsal, or next to Hefsal. And what does it mean actually for you to practice all these kind of more communal approaches to farming in a place where Hefsal Gardens seems to have been acknowledged, preserved, turned into heritage, and yet the kind of whole social ecology around it is very extractive. And how do you use your own farm in terms of the broader kind of relationships that might revolve around the farm? You've told us a great deal about the seeds, your approach to trying to avoid monoculture, etc. But is there a way you maybe distribute the produce that you grow Are there other ways in terms of the social ecologies that revolve around your farm? How do you then kind of combat these emerging extractive industries, right? Of something like Hevsel Gardens becoming a kind of extractive tourist kind of site, and again, Comfort, maybe you could relate to this somehow by talking to us a little bit more about how this kind of non-conventionally extractive industry of humor and pidgin and how that might also be linked to the conventional industries, extractive industries like oil extraction. Is there a link there? So is it just kind of this, the extractivist approach expanding onto new realms, or is it also a process where the existing conventional extractive industries are also involved in that process somehow? Is there a relationship between something like oil extraction and something like the extractive industrialization of humor? That makes sense.
Well, that was one hell of a question, wasn't it? So let me briefly talk about the UNESCO process. So during my presentation, I mentioned something. The people in this geography managed to domesticate animals, and they cultivated wheat, and that created the center of attraction, which attracted many peoples to the geography, and in consequence led to the fact that these people stole. And this is exactly what happened with Hevsel. Once Hevsel was listed as a cultural heritage site, this is what happened to Hevsel as well. And I was opposing this from the very beginning because it's now prone to exploitation. Once Hevsel was known, and this is maybe human nature, I'm not sure, but human beings, once something comes to their attention, immediately want to change the value and importance of things. So what am I doing against this? This year, I planted chickpeas. Let me briefly talk about that. I tried to not use pesticides. I used women as workers because I wanted to give them an opportunity to work as well. And chickpeas have a retail price of 40 Turkish lira right now per kilogram. I sell it for 30 kilogram because I want it to be affordable. And let me also mention that a lot of effort and dedication goes into the cultivation of chickpeas. I want everybody to have access to healthy, nutritional food. And this is what makes me happy. Because everybody knows, as I've mentioned in my presentation, everybody knows how much wheat costs and what the importance is, but they don't know the value of it. And the same goes for chickpeas or any other, anything else that you plant. And human life and violence used to be so prevalent in this geography. This is why comedy is not really something I can think of or I engage myself at, because for the past 7 years, for example, I haven't been on holiday, neither have I been to a wedding ceremony, for example, because it's a celebration. I wish that everybody knew what my cultural includes in terms of wedding ceremonies. Those wedding ceremonies in my culture are the most elaborate and most pompous wedding ceremonies, but there is no opportunity anymore to hold these. But you gave me food for thought, so thank you very much. Let me think about the relationship to comedy and other newly emerging extractivist approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ira, for that question. Thank you, Zeki, for your answer and your talk earlier. I learned a lot, and I'm learning a lot from it. I mean, your question to me, I guess, is there a link between the traditionally extractivist industry of oil and the reading I'm doing of the comedy and pidgin sort of extractivist structure in an industry that's not traditionally extractivist, right? And I think that there is a relationship, and it's especially in this context, there's an undeniable relationship because oil already plays such a major role in shaping the relationship that the Niger Delta has to the rest of the country. If you think about the way that Nigeria is politically structured, the Niger Delta region is basically made up of micro minorities that have not as much, because they're so diffuse and there's so many, and the aggregate does not have as much, not the aggregate, the individual sort of communities in that aggregate do not have as much representation in the national government, especially given the way that their ancestral lands and their regions contributes very unevenly to the economy of the nation. Like Nigeria is a monocultural economy, right? Relying on oil, and most of that oil comes from this region. And you know, that resource is treated as belonging to the entire nation, right? And so their lands and their waters, where this resource is contained, belongs to all of Nigeria, but the responsibility doesn't. The responsibility of stewardship doesn't. And so it's everyone's land and no man's land at the same time. And I think that history, that sort of, not just history, that history and present and future, because it doesn't seem to be changing very much, is very important to keep in mind in other kinds of engagements of the culture of the region, because I think it is because of that extractivist industry of oil and the way that it has kind of had its impacts on the region, that has enabled reading extractivism in this other thing. So the fear, or the link, is that there is a fear of recreating this ongoing subjugation or this ongoing problem in this arena where the resource is language, the resource is comedy or whatever else. So yeah, I think there's definitely a strong link, at least, even if it's not an explicit link. I think the one informs the other. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, I think it's my turn to jump in to facilitate the Q&A section of the event. We have just over 10 minutes left, and I don't see any questions up in the Q&A right now, so I would encourage anyone from the audience who has a question to put a note in the Q&A, or even if you'd like to just wave your hand, or just let us know that you have a question. We have a little bit of time. But in the meantime, I wonder whether Grace or Irai might have any other things coming up. But I see Chivo Arthur has made a comment. I wonder whether you would like to speak your comment or question. If so, Arthur, please feel free to unmute yourself, and you will have to go through that process of selecting English. Let's see if it works. Hello.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, great. Yeah, I just wanted to thank the presenters for these educative the educative presentations. I think my question now I have two questions. Okay, I think my question is for Comfort. Thanks, Zeki. Yeah, I mean, I really loved your presentation, and I think I learned a lot for me. But I'm wondering, first, this language of extraction, and I know where this is coming from, given the history of the Niger Delta as this site of resource extraction, even before the contemporary dispensation based on oil. That region had witnessed a lot of extractivist, violent extractivist activities. Colonial times, it was palm oil and other kinds of resources. Prior to that, slaves were extracted from that region, mostly in that part of West Africa, right? So it's the hub of these kinds of extractivist practices. But I'm wondering whether that language of extraction is very useful in the context of culture, especially when we consider pidgin as a resource that Niger Delta peoples own, and Nigerians extracting that resource without duly acknowledging or taking compensating the owners of that language appropriately. So I just don't yeah, that tension is what I'm interested in, the extent to which we can consider pidgin in Nigeria a language owned by the Niger Delta that is now being extracted in cultural practices across the country. And my second question, again, on pidgin, it seemed like you read pidgin a bit teleologically as evolving from a state to becoming Creole. I might be wrong. Maybe I didn't hear that very well. But I was wondering how we can predict how a language like pidgin can evolve into a Creole, if it's not already that. And so the language of evolution seems to suggest that pidgin is developing from a simple state to a rather complex state, or a creolized form that it's not yet the state of that language. That's just kind of clarification on that. But thanks a lot for these presentations.
Thank you very much, Chibo, for your questions. That's great. I think your first question, gets at the uneasiness that I was talking about earlier, because like I was saying to Grace with her question, pidgin does exist all over the country. And that is something that's, just a fact, even if it is established that it originated in this part of the country, or it first developed in this part of the country. Not to say it would not have developed in other parts, given that if they were given, if there was a chance or things happen differently. So treating it as something that's ownable and extractable, and requiring due acknowledgement, there's an uneasiness there. But I think with my work on the comedy industry in particular, the stand-up comedy industry in particular, it was useful to think in those terms because of the phenomenon I observed, where most of the comedy is delivered in pidgin English, and also the character archetype, specifically a character that's from Warri or some other Niger Delta city, is a prevalent sort of trope in this industry. Like those things going hand in hand, it seemed like there's an undeniable link there. This kind of connects to your second question, the fact that this character archetype is coded primarily through pidgin and through a Creole pidgin, right? Is something that I thought was really important, and that's why the extractivist reading came in. But there is an uneasiness with using that extractivist reading because of the points that you've noted. As to the Creole and reading pidgin as evolving and so on, I think that's really just the work of linguistics, of linguists, and I'm not a linguist, but there is a distinction that linguists make between different versions of languages, pidgin being supposedly like a language of emergence that then develops into a Creole, and a Creole becomes its own thing, and so on and so forth. But we're not going to switch from calling Nigerian pidgin Nigerian Creole, even if it has become a Creole in certain parts of the country. And so I think it's a problem of terminology that expert terminology that the people are not going to deal with, right? So it does exist as a Creole in parts of the Delta region. And then there are still parts of the country, like if you go to Abuja or Lagos or parts of Lagos, where it's still a language of emergency and people are not using it in this Creolized form. And so I think I wasn't reading it as in this evolutionary way. I was acknowledging the ways that it has been understood from that linguistic point of view. I hope that answers all your questions.
Thanks so much for that. Grace, Ira, do you have any further comments?
Yeah, I might just go back to actually, because I realized that maybe I wasn't clear enough, because because I noticed Zeki referred to the humor aspect of what I said, and that obviously was more related to Comfort's presentation. But what I meant was, and Zeki addressed things like how they want to make, for example, chickpeas more affordable, and that they prioritize employing women, for example. And these are exactly the kinds of things that maybe I think we can maybe think more about. What I mean by the social ecologies that actually kind of help us engage critically with something like this Hefsal Gardens, for example, becoming the subject of this extractivist tourist industry, and engaging that not only like physically but also socially in terms of the social worlds that one creates around one's practice. And I know that increasingly you, Zeki, have groups of students coming to the farm, right? Wanting to spend time there, and maybe that's one thing that you might expand upon. How do you find these students and their interests, and how do they react to what you're doing? But also, how do other farmers respond to what you're doing? Because obviously, kind of corporate seeds, they are problematic. We know the problems. We've talked about the problems. They are commercial, corporate. They don't reproduce or self-reproduce. But there's one thing that they promise, which is productivity, and that's very, very appealing for many farmers. And I wonder, how do you talk to other farmers about this? How do they respond to your take on seeds and your insistence on using local seeds? Do they say, "Oh, that's all great and well, but that doesn't give us the yield that we need. It's not productive"? Or how do you convince them? Do you have these kinds of more, conflicted conversations, and how do you negotiate those?
And I'm sorry to say we only have a couple of minutes, so no pressure, but please, a brief answer. Thank you, Zeki.
Thank you so much. It will be a short answer. Well, the Hefsal Gardens are right next to Diyarbakır's castle, right? Adjacent to the castle, but nobody knows about them. They know the name. There are some fantasies about them, about these gardens, but Many people have never been there. They've never felt being there. Not only just students, not only children. We organize campaigns, we bring schools, we bring professionals, we bring the elderly, and I introduce the gardens to them. And when there's a Hafsal visit, they always invite me. And those interactions also show you that there's ecophobia. People are so scared when they see a bug on them because they have no contact with nature. And the only way to overcome this is to have contact with nature. And we keep working towards that end. Of course, unfortunately, there's a saying about by Kurds. They say, the grass in your own garden is always bitter. Or the tree's worm comes from the tree itself. Whatever we own, we see it to be problematic or not good enough. Our villagers, our peasants, go to the markets to buy saplings and seeds. They don't protect their own seeds. It has some psychological aspects to it. And, unfortunately, we're not able to overcome this problem.
Can I just add one more thing to my answer?
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So I in answer your question, I missed one portion of my answer, which is to say that the extractivist reading of the stand-up comedy industry is particularly important if you keep in mind the economic aspect of making these shows as lucrative as possible. And pidgin English allows a wider accessibility and dissemination that makes these shows way more lucrative than other forms of comedy outside of the stand-up industry, where there might be tape recordings of jokes, but these are usually delivered in the local language of the region where that comedian is from, and so on. So keeping in mind the way that capitalism plays a role in this is important for why that extractivist reading is useful.
Thank you, Comfort. Thank you, Zeki. Thank you, everyone, for attending our third Decolonial Cities dialogue. And one of the things that I really like about these dialogues is putting together certain things that you never would have thought to put together. So today we learned about seeds, gardening, but what came out of it, as Irai brilliantly summarized, at least for me, is the how, for example, heritage, humor are becoming extractive industries. I know that's one of the things that that's going to be one of the things that I'm going to be thinking quite a bit about today, and thinking through how we really need to have more dialogues with each other, and to not be in our in our own silos. Huge shout out to Melanie and Tenzil for helping us with the logistics of today, for taking care of tech. And Melanie, especially, for keeping us in order. Hirai and I were sometimes all over the place, and she'll be like, okay, we need to plan this dialogue. Did you have something to say, Zeki? I wasn't, okay, no. So everyone, have a wonderful weekend, and yes, and keep fighting capitalism.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Bye.
Thank you. Zor spas mamuste.